Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes as we're waiting for some more folks to hop on. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We're very excited to talk to you about our new research and policy brief, Funding Our Future, about centering equity and impact in New York's post-secondary funding formula. This is the culmination of research that we've been doing for about over a year, ranging from landscape analysis to a lot of conversations, surveys, interviews, focus groups with various stakeholders across New York State. And we're really excited to talk to you about what we found today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So as we get started, we would love if you all would drop your names and affiliations just a chat if you're comfortable, just so we can get a sense of who's in the room or Zoom with us. And as you do that, we'd love for you all to answer the following question. What percent of New York State funding do you think goes to first-gen students? So feel free to be as imaginative as you like, just to really kind of, get a feel of what you guys know.
Hi, Samantha. Thanks for hopping in the chat. So Samantha said 35%.
Mm-hmm. Ooh,
Hey, Joshua. Joshua said 20. Heidi said less than 5.
keep it coming, guys. Thanks.
We have 15%, 10%, 5%. Cool. All solid guesses.
All right.
We have 7%, 15%.
Yeah, just give another second if anyone wants to jump in with any more. These are all great guesses. All right. If you guys are ready for the answer, awesome. 20%. Okay, cool. All right. So time for the reveal. It's actually a trick question. So as it currently stands, New York State does not have specific percentage of funding allocated exclusively to first generation students. At least it's not public reported. So that's a really big part of some of the work that we did in terms of like transparency about the funding and specific allocation for certain demographics of students. So thank you guys for kind of engaging with us there. But yeah, the reality is there isn't an exact number for percentage going to first-gen students. So as you can see, we have a lot to cover today, right? But it's all really, really important and a big part of how we develop this brief. from who we are as young invincibles and why this work is really imperative to, our values. The landscape that we did, as Sean had mentioned, the research, the folks that we spoke to, such as students and stakeholders, and really what are the next action steps that come as a result of this work.
So to contextualize, first we want to do some introductions, starting with who is Young Invincibles, right? Why are we here? Why are we talking about this issue? Young Invincibles is a national nonprofit organization. Our mission is to amplify the voices of young adults in the political process and expand economic opportunity for our generations. What does that mean? That means that we're trying to make sure that young folks have a seat at the table, have a voice in the policy conversations that impact them, especially on some of the key issues that we work on, such as higher education access and affordability, comprehensive health care, workforce development, and civic engagement, which is really the glue that holds working on all of these issues together, because we want to make sure that young adults are in the policy conversations with us, that we're not making policies for young adults, but with young adults at every step of the way. So I'm Sean Miller to introduce myself. I use pronouns he, him, and I'm the Northeast Regional Director here. I'll pass things over to Zakira.
Hi everyone, I'm Zakira Rahman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a policy fellow with Young Invincibles, and I've had the pleasure of being a former young advocate with their Young Advocates program back this past fall. So thank you guys for joining us. I'll pass it off to Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lisa Nishimura. I'm the New York Engagement Coordinator for Young Invincibles. So I run all of our youth engagement programming, including the Young Advocates program. So I'm happy to see Sakura and a couple of other folks who have been a part of our YAP. And my pronouns are they, AJ, she, or Aja. And I will pass it on to Lo.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, my reception over here might be stopping up a little bit. Can you hear me? Perfect. My name is Lo Anderson. I'm the student engagement coordinator for a pilot initiative called CUNY Cares. So I'm so privileged to be here with Young Invincibles today. We've actually been on the ground doing a lot of co-organizing and capacity building together in terms of getting students involved with policy. So for me, I'm super passionate about that. I just graduated from John Jay with my BS in Human Services and Community Justice. So I'm definitely going to bring the community engagement element to that and trying to draw more students from the Bronx into this conversation and into, being relevant stakeholders when it comes to building these policies. So happy to be here today, and I'm going to pass it to Jose.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Jose. I also did the Young Advocates program this past semester, and I also graduated from SUNY New Paltz with a degree in IR, International Relations and Economics. So I'm also I'm also a part of the Global Peace Ambassadorship program with the Institute of Public Policy and Diplomatic Research. And I'm really excited to be here to bring my perspective of just being a student at the being a part of a SUNY campus, and also a historical angle that actually shows like why we're here on this panel and what Young Invincible stands for and how this was designed. So I'm really happy to bring that historical analysis to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. As you can see, we have a wonderful panel today. All right. So I'm going to just quickly drop our brief into our chat so you guys can get a quick look. But I just want to give you a quick snapshot of what it is that we, developed for recommendations as a result of working on this brief. So the goal is essentially to have New York pilot a hybrid, equity-centered, and performance-informed funding model through a phased 3 to 5 year implementation. You may ask why 3 to 5 years. So the reality is this work takes time. It will always take time, but it's actually a benefit, if anything, to take time doing this to make sure that we put proper thought and consideration into the pilot. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about the 3 steps that we feel like are key to this work, starting with one minority serving institution and one transfer focused community college at both CUNY and SUNY. Pass it off to Sean.
All right. So Before we really dig into our recommendations, we want to give a little bit of context to why we're proposing this pilot program, why we want to have increased funding for, starting with one MSI, one minority serving institution, and one high transfer school at CUNY and SUNY getting increased funding, right? Part of setting that landscape is understanding that our current funding model for New York's public higher education has limitations, some serious limitations that other states are already starting to account for. And specifically, it fails to account for modern student demographics, for key differences in institutional mission and performance outcomes. And so many high need institutions are left without the adequate funding or resources that they need to ensure that all of their students that they're serving today in 2025, right, can thrive. And the student population also looks very different than it did 20, 30, especially 40, 50 years ago. And so we want to make sure that our funding model today is keeping pace with the realities that our current demographics of students, our current needs of students, our current assets of students are bringing to our institutions. So we're going to unpack some of these terms, right? We don't want it to be too jargony. But when we say institutional mission, for example, one of the things that we're referring to is that, different CUNY and SUNY schools have different purposes and priorities that they set out based on the population that they serve, the areas of study or degrees that they offer, the workforce attainment rates that they're going for, and whether or not they're a research institution, right? Some schools might be more on the academic side of things. Some schools might be trying to get students immediately into career and technical education and workforce experience. But what we're advocating for is a mix of performance-informed and equity-informed funding. And so we've seen this model in a couple other states. We've seen research on, these two different ways of funding higher education in order to try to improve outcomes. The first is the performance-informed funding model. And what that means is tying some institutional funding to metrics like degree completion, retention, or transfer rate, so that schools that are really good at matriculating students, graduating students, would get an increase in funding in order to grow that capacity. The other is equity-informed funding. And so this is where there's an additional allocation of funding based purely on student characteristics. So this could look like student income, right? For which we often use Pell Grant eligibility as a proxy. It could be first generation status, part-time status versus full-time, or race. We know that students that are coming from Black, Latin, or Hispanic backgrounds face additional and historical challenges in graduating, right? And that there's a degree attainment gap. And so one of the things that we're looking into is this should be an explicit focus, right, of how we fund higher education to make sure that students that have these barriers that come from these backgrounds are getting the supports they need. One of the things, however, we've seen within our landscape analysis is that each of these approaches, the performance approach and the equity-informed approach, have their limitations. And so there's some mixed research on performance, especially suggesting that in some cases it seems to work a little bit. In other cases, it's not really a clear case for it. In equity-informed funding, there isn't a lot of examples of this in public higher education. There's a lot of examples of this, however, in K-12, when we look at, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or the ESSA and things like the Title I program being enormously successful in K-12, right? And part of what we're doing to some extent is applying that here from the K-12 space to higher education as well. But what we really want to do is combine both of these models that we know have limited success individually into a hybrid approach. And so this would combine performance and equity metrics to factor in both student outcomes and characteristics into how institutions are getting funded.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to speak a bit more to the equity piece, which is a key part of all this. As it currently stands, students from low-income backgrounds, first-generation students, and underrepresented students often encounter systemic hurdles that make it hard for them to receive quality education and to be able to move up economically. The table that I outlined below shows you 2 CUNY institutions and 2 SUNY institutions, 2 of which are 2 years, 2 of which are 4 years, Stony Brook, Nassau, Brooklyn, and Kingsborough. As you can see, 3 out of 4 are minority-serving institutions, and you can sense a bit of a pattern with that and the graduation rates and eligible percent of eligible students at these institutions. For instance, you have Stony Brook, which is a large research university, versus Nassau Community College, which is also on Long Island, or even Kingsborough, which both have a focus on career and technical education. However, all across CUNY and SUNY, only 51% of students are graduating on time, which is within 4 to 6 years. And something I'd like to really highlight is part-time students, which Sean had mentioned in the previous slide. So part-time students often do get left out of the conversation. According to a 2022 report by the Lumina Foundation, nearly half of today's students are enrolled part-time. Part-time students are disproportionately BIPOC, community college, and older, aka older than 25 learners. And these are students who are working. These are students who might be student parents. These are students who might be commuting to school. And it's so crucial that their circumstances are being included and being accommodated for.
So I covered this a bit already, but what we're putting forward here, having this hybrid approach, right, is really drawing from the fact that these two approaches alone have very limited results, right? But together, we've already seen examples of some states that have taken on this hybrid approach and had really good results. So we want to combine both equity and performance to make sure that we are investing in schools that are really good at graduating students, at getting students to the workforce, right, as well. But we're also investing heavily in schools that are functionally or explicitly minority-serving institutions, right? As well as schools that we know explicitly are engines of social mobility, are catering to students coming from low-income backgrounds, many Pell eligible working class backgrounds, right? Because we know that these schools in particular are going to need more resources, are going to need more counselors, are going to need more faculty to ensure that those students can succeed. The extent to which they have part-time students, right? This is also a population that tends to be working, right? They very often have a job. They're much more likely to have a job that's more than 20 hours per week. They're much more likely to have a family or to be a caretaker for someone in their family. And so we know that all of these aspects of students, um, you know, require more resources, require more wraparound services, also often require investing in their basic needs and ensuring that you have a comprehensive approach to ensuring that these students aren't dealing with things that could lead to dropout, like food insecurity and hunger, housing insecurity and homelessness, lack of adequate access to mental health resources, transportation issues, right? These are all basic needs things that we see at much higher rates among this population. And so we need to be investing intentionally and heavily to make sure that those students also have the additional resources, supports, and trusted individuals at their institutions to ensure that they get to the finish line and get that degree.
We've been able to speak to you all a little bit about what these policy approaches sound like in theory, and states like Sean has mentioned have already kind of done these. So we have Tennessee, for example, which is known for pioneering a performance or outcome-based model as the first state to do so way back in 2010. And this model has definitely helped them steadily raise their educational attainment and is often cited nationally as a proof point for how embedding student outcomes can really boost education attainment as a whole. Tennessee itself, since 2010, has seen a 13% increase in Pell eligible students enrolled in post the funding model. And a bit more specific about some of the things that they do, they do use metrics like graduation, retention, and course completion, with some safeguards built in to support institutions that are serving these high need students. Then we have California, which similarly had also had an increase in Pell eligible students enrolled from 2020 to 2024. California is very similar to New York in the population that they serve, with a lot of low income and first gen students. And they are really known for their student-centered funding formula that they passed back in 2018, which provides additional funding for low-income, first-generation, and foster youth students while rewarding improvements in retention and degree completion. And I really want to highlight foster youth here as well, as and they really make sure that they're considering students who are coming from all sorts of marginalized backgrounds. And California also has dashboards that they've built in that highlight the comparison between before the funding model and during the funding model, even providing a breakdown in terms of district all across California with measures such as the performance and funding all across. And last but not least, we have Illinois, which is striving to combine equity-weighted performance-based funding, and we've heavily drawn inspiration from their model. They've spent the last few years, honestly, building a really comprehensive strategic plan that's really proved to be thoughtful and intentional in terms of how they're building in some of those measures that we've spoken about. And we've also seen that within the last decade or so, they've had a huge increase in the percentage of students or adults who have a post-secondary degree from 38% to 57%, with their state goal being 60%. So they've gotten pretty close. And lastly, we have our recommendations.
So because of all this, we've come to the conclusion that we should reform New York higher education funding. We don't need to do it overnight, right? I think taking that slow, steady, and intentional approach is key to ensuring that it is successful. New York currently operates on what's called a base plus model. So this means that institutions can receive a base amount tied to prior year's funding, as well as adjustments made for things like inflation, enrollment, and other shifting priorities. But what's missing is a really systemic or systematic link between student outcomes like retention, graduation, and equity and the funding that schools get. So we want to put this into practice by launching a demonstration-based pilot. We're also taking a lot of inspiration from CUNY Cares, so it's wonderful that Lo is here to be able to talk more about that, right, as another demonstration-based pilot, which has been incredibly successful so far at 3 of our CUNY schools in the Bronx. But the way that we're proposing this pilot for reforming New York's higher education funding is selecting a handful of representative CUNY and SUNY campuses. So we want to have at least one minority serving institution or MSI at CUNY and at SUNY, and at least one high volume transfer community college at CUNY and at SUNY to trial the new funding formula, to trial the new model.
And as you shared, we really want to make sure that we're centering equity in all this work. So that includes, including weighted inputs such as, income, which has eligibility encompassed under that, first generation status, transfer rates, a minority serving institution designation, and measurable outcomes as well, which is where the performance side comes in, such as retention, graduation, degree completion, and credentials that are earned in high demand fields. And really this hybrid approach ensures that we're rewarding institutions for serving high institutions and holding the system accountable for student success to really fulfill the promise of delivering high quality education to students.
Finally, we want to ensure that there is transparency, data-informed decision-making, and stakeholder voice at every step in the process. And so we imagine that this would look like having a public dashboard with requirements around sharing data, tracking, equity and performance metrics of rollout for the performance model itself, as well as the actual metrics of success, such as retention, graduation rates, on-time graduation rates, enrollment, all these different aspects of school success. And then most importantly, disaggregating that data based on demographics, right? We want to know not just the overall figures, but the extent to which these schools are or are not succeeding in graduating Black, Latin, low income, Pell eligible students, part-time students as well, right? And we know that this is a population that's going to continue increasing as we see, some wonderful new Reconnect programs like SUNY Reconnect growing and proliferating in the same way that CUNY Reconnect has. Most importantly, true to our nature as Young Invincibles, we want to make sure that there's student voice at every step of the process, but also that this is a comprehensive community conversation that includes faculty, staff, and the entire institutional community, families as well, in the assessment and review of annual outcomes and data. We also want to see clear success metrics. So, for example, one of the goals could be 6% increase in low-income or Pell eligible students' degree completion by the end of year 2. But in order to get there, we need to make sure that we are tracking how close we are to achieving this at every step of the way, and having ideally at least quarterly conversations with the community in order to make sure that if there's issues, right, in achieving that 6% increase, that students can bring it up, faculty can bring it up, staff can bring up the challenges that they're seeing, and that course corrections can happen.
Thank you, Sean. And then speaking of staff, we definitely want to talk a little bit more about some of the potential barriers and considerations for implementing this. So we definitely recognize that there's a lot of capacity needed to make this happen. They'll need more staff to manage reporting. They'll need more staff to support with advising, coaches to support students, even IT upgrades to make sure that we can handle disaggregated data and performance data as well. However, the return on this is so crucial and could lead to better data-informed decision-making all across the board.
One of the other key considerations that we want to uplift is that, while a couple other states have done this, New York has a very unique policy landscape, right? We've often seen that in other states, they're able to pass through their legislature specific appropriations for schools. However, that's not how it works in New York, right? CUNY and SUNY, respectively, get a certain pot of money and then are able to break that down into their various needs. So it's very different here, right? We also have our own unique um, political landscape and differences based on the CUNY system, right? And specifically the community colleges at CUNY getting a lot of their funds from the city versus the SUNY schools, especially the four-year schools, getting the majority of their funding from the state. We also have the community colleges across SUNY getting the majority of their funding from their local municipality. So there's a lot of different nuance in trying to apply one big approach across the entire state, right? With all of these different funding buckets, all these different political complexities, right? You also have the role of the city council in New York City, the mayor in New York City. We have some shifting political dynamics, as many folks know, right now in New York City. So these are all things that we want to be mindful of and intentional of as we're continuing to research and allocate for this new model.
Of course. And really, the success of this really depends on buy-in. Students, faculty, staff need to be engaged early on in the process to make sure that they know how this might improve the institutions. Students especially have a right to be aware of the systems and mechanisms that are providing them an education. Without this alignment, the work won't have any impact, will be stalled even before it begins. So it's really crucial that all these different stakeholders get a seat at the table as this process is happening. And and next up, we want to make sure that we actually hear from the students and faculty member themselves. So we're going to hear a few testimonials from folks who have, taken the time to share their perspectives with us, how higher education funding has impacted them directly on their campuses.
Okay, so we're going to get into our first student testimonial here. This is from Stefan, who graduated from CUNY John Jay and transferred from Hostos Community College. So Stefan says, Hostos is very much an open place in terms of getting students accessibility services. They tell you that it's okay to ask them for those resources, and they make those resources easily accessible and easy to locate. At John Jay, my experience was completely different. It was very hard to locate services there. I needed emergency support that wasn't available, and the criteria for those services weren't properly defined to me. So as a person who basically took this very same path, honestly, when I returned to school after a 10.5-year break, I started at Hostos, which if you know anything about Hostos Community College, is a place where many people in the community go to re-begin their educational journey and to try to get access to more social mobility. So a place where we can highlight that success is already happening across the board. I can definitely affirm what Stefan said in the aspect of hostos is that community that makes it okay to ask for help, but it still experiences its own silos in the aspect of I can ask maybe 20 students, and some students still don't know that there's a campus food pantry, that there's counseling services. Like those gaps still very much exist. I'm particularly passionate about like improving funding for higher education because this also happened to me in my experience, right? I was facing like mental health support concerns. And back in 2010, when I was first accessing services at Hunter College, there was only like a 3 appointment maybe policy. And now those services are much more comprehensive, but what I think it does to shape a policy alongside these kinds of gaps mean that it stops being so stigmatized and something that's just happening to community members, right? And it starts being something that the institution understands is happening and can be more responsive to in real time, right? And I think that that's definitely key to getting more students through the door in terms of graduation, and was certainly for me once I came back to CUNY and I saw how comprehensive the services were, I became so much more passionate about sharing that with my community, which is why I'm in the position that I've been, trying to make sure that students access services every day on campus.
Okay, I'll take the next quote. Thank you very much, Flo, for that. And actually, I resonate with you and Stefan as well in terms of the us transferring from a community college to a SUNY, because I went to WCC before I transferred to SUNY New Paltz and so on and so forth. But let me read the next quote. So this is from Gabrielle Lerner, SUNY Empire State, graduate student and former student gov president. All right, she's got receipts. So the institution doesn't ask what they need. There's a huge disconnect. People making decisions on our behalf without ever speaking to us. So much support is buried under bureaucracy or scattered across departments. You can't assume students will figure it out, especially when we're already juggling jobs, rent, and coursework. We need more centralized communication and people who are specifically tasked with helping students navigate these systems. It shouldn't be this hard to get help when you're trying to stay in school and survive. So I resonate with this completely because for the last 2 semesters, at SUNY New Paltz, I was part-time for the fall semester of 2024 and full-time for the spring semester of 2025, but I had a huge commute. And I didn't live on campus to save money. So I was commuting from Westchester in the Yonkers area. So that's like an hour and a half drive without traffic, leaving early, making sure I'm getting to my classes on time and everything. So there wasn't a lot of part-time student resources. And funny enough, when I was graduating this past semester, they started making a commuter lounge, which is a great start, but that could have been great like last year or a few years ago, and so on and so forth. And then this quote that Gabrielle says captures the heart of what we're trying to do, right? Marginalized students and other students that are bouncing so many different things aren't failing because they lack drive. They're failing because supports are buried under bureaucracy. So if you're working 2 jobs paying rent, you don't have time to decode and red tape. Equity-based funding isn't just about resources, it's about making those resources visible, accessible, and student-centered.
Thank you for that, Jose. And that was wonderful. And thank you for tying in your experiences as well. Now, I will also be reading another YP alum's quote, Gregory. Gregory was early on in the call, but I definitely want to highlight his quote because he does talk a lot about his experience and the differences in resources, transferring from a 2-year college to a 4-year college, and just giving a little bit of insight into how these resources could be more accessible to students. So Gregory said, when I started at Borough Manhattan Community College, BMCC, everything I needed was right there. Single Stop was a hub for support, but when I left college briefly to work and came back, it was gone. When I transferred to Baruch, the resources felt even harder to find. There was a real lack of visibility and awareness. We need more funding, not just for the services themselves, but to actually promote them. That means making information accessible through using platforms students actually engage with, like social media. There also needs to be more front-facing conversation with the students to give them an opportunity to voice their needs. And so Greg talks a lot about, again, like the differences in resources when he was at BMCC, which is a 2-year college, and then going from BMCC to Baruch, which had single stop. For folks who are not aware, single stop was at certain select CUNY colleges. I know John Jay was one of them, BMCC. I know BMCC ever since the contract had ended, back I think in 2019 or 2020. Please someone correct me on that. But ever since that contract had ended, there has been no really a sustainability of those resources. So I know at BMCC, it's called the Advocacy Resource Center, ARC, on something along those lines. So that's what Greg is referring to. But unfortunately, all those resources was cut. And he's trying to say that these resources should be sustainable. So even if the contract was cut with single stop, it should have still continued on so that folks such as Gregory and other folks who are experiencing basic needs insecurities or other challenges should be able to access those resources. And then the piece about him talking about promoting these resources and promoting about like the higher education funding formula, like colleges need to do a better job of being able to advertise those resources and also being able to engage student voices. And so I really resonate with Greg on this. I had my own experiences with basic needs. And so definitely, and I know Lakeisha also in the chat had talked about CBOs making up for the shortfalls. And yes, definitely agree. And this is why we need to be in partnership with all the folks on this call. So thank you again so much for being a part of this conversation. And now I will pass it on to Zakira and Sean to read stakeholder perspectives.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And again, I've resonated with everything you guys have shared thus far because again, it is so, so important. And I want to just again emphasize like being able to hear from people directly impacted by this is also such a big part of all this. So next up, I'll be reading a quote from Jennifer Guburi, who's a lecturer and advisor at Hunter College and PSC CUNY first vice president. So she has such a powerful perspective when it comes to, how higher education can be doing so much more. We need to start thinking about public higher education the way we think about public transit. CUNY works because of our density. We educate and uplift more people per dollar than almost any other system in the country. But when states disinvest, there's just not much happening. Places like North Carolina have a robust research corridor that draws long-term investment. In contrast, CUNY is a local engine with a massive economic multiplier effect, yet we struggle to communicate that impact clearly. We should show lawmakers and the public a clear story. Here's where state investment goes, who it serves, and the long-term return on that investment, right down to the zip code. So I think this quote kind of speaks for itself, but honestly, like New York and New York City, especially with the CUNY system, does so much and it produces so much in terms of giving back to the city. Myself as a CUNY alum, I can really speak to the impact that CUNY has on its students, faculty, and everyone involved. But again, there seems to be a disconnect in terms of how we kind of champion that story. So thank you to Jen for sharing this. Who's on the call with us? So, and lastly, I'll pass it off to Sean.
All right. Finally, we have a quote from a representative from the SUNY office. They're not identified, but were very gracious to share this and their input with us. So they said, when we talk about the funding in different categories, something that people get very excited about is this concept of administrative bloat, where some folks think funding should only go to professors and maybe labs and nothing else. Like everything else is just unnecessary, and that's why colleges cost too much money. But a lot of things that we've been really finding are very impactful in recent years. Our programs like EOP, Education Opportunity Program, ACE and ASAP, and basic needs supports could be made their own category, like student support. As it is now, it all gets lumped in as non-instructional, and that's when people are going to want to cut. But we have found that those programs really make a difference in regards to retention and completion. Very appreciative for this quote. I think one of the most important things that it also highlights, right, is that it's hard to understand how the funding is being allocated for things like student support services, for EOP, for ACE and ASAP, right? It's hard to know and to do research into the extent to which certain populations of students are not getting funding because there's no specific bucket for that population, right? This is also something that Zakira and I came across during the research phase as far as, the hook that we had at the beginning around how much funding is going to part-time students or first-generation college students. Well, it's very hard to answer that because there is no specific budget, there is no specific allocation or formula that dictates how much funding those students get in New York. And so one of the things that we're also advocating for here as far as transparency and ensuring that we have good data on higher education funding is trying to separate some of these things out into buckets, or at least reclassify some of these terms. That way we can have a much better and clearer understanding of how we're investing our higher education funds in New York and who they're going to and who they're not going to.
Thank you, Sean. And also, I just want to uplift. Sorry, I just want to uplift Josh's comment about an opportunity to reimagine and redesign. I think that's a really big thing. The fact that there's so much room to do better, and honestly, I think that's a fantastic idea in terms of having some sort of like universal or uniform or central support center like that.
All right. So we have all this research, we have these proposals, and now what are we going to do about it? Well, we have a call to action for all of y'all on this call, and for everyone in your networks, for everyone in our networks. First, modernize the formula. We need to align funding with student needs, with campus missions, with outcomes, and with the realities of who is attending public higher education in New York today. So that's the first one. The second one, advance equity, ensure that high need campuses receive the resources they need to help close these gaps, right? We need to be intentional about closing post-secondary attainment gaps as a goal that we should be striving towards in New York State, as a stated goal that we should be tracking and working to close every year, right? Seeing how close we're getting at that disaggregated data piece and making progress. And then finally, boost accountability. Policymakers, education leaders shouldn't be doing this alone, right? This is dreamwork makes the teamwork kind of situation, or many hands make like light work, right? And one important way to make sure that we can access that community of support that each institution has, that we can tap into that, is increasing transparency and tying funding to student success. So that way, students, their families, the community at large can all be stakeholders that are working to achieve this success in tandem with lawmakers, in tandem with higher education leaders, with university presidents, with every level of government as well. And with the business community and the workforce at large, right? We want to make sure that we are not siloed from them, especially at our community colleges that are often trying to forge relationships or forging wonderful relationships with workforce in their local economies, right? We want to make sure that everyone is at that table looking at the data at regular intervals and being very intentional about bringing people together to look at the data together and figure out where they can improve.
And we do recognize this is not an easy battle, but it is built on decades of incredible work that people have already done to make higher education more accessible for students. And New York especially is constantly under a spotlight, so we're uniquely positioned to do better for the students in our state and be a shining beacon for other regions all across the country.
I would also add that, a couple other states have beat us to the punch, right? Illinois most recently, California has been working on this for quite a bit and having some great results. Tennessee, 15 years ago. Wow. Like that's pioneering for Tennessee. Um, but it's really time for New York to lead. And this particular political moment, right, when we know that higher education, that diversity, equity, and inclusion are under attack, when we know that students of color, right, are under attack, it's really important that we double down and invest in social mobility, invest in institutions that are serving the mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensuring a just chance at that American dream for all students.
And with that, we do have a sign-on letter for you all that we'll drop in the chat just now. Oh, sorry. Hopefully that's a right one. Oh, 1 second. One moment. Always some sort of technical difficulty, so just want to make sure. All right.
All good. So as Zakir is dropping that in the chat, we're asking everyone, please check out the sign-on letter. At the very least, we hope that you or your organization will sign on. You can sign on in either capacity as an individual. If you can sign on as an organization, even better. And then there's different levels of engagement that you can indicate on the form. So if just signing on is all you have capacity to do right now, no worries. We appreciate that. Having your name or your organization's name there is going to be helpful as we gather more support in order to make this reality. We're also planning to have other events in the future to further uplift this, press conferences, possibly rallies, meetings with legislators to help get this idea out there and to find support. And so you can indicate those things on the form as well. Carrying this forward, we plan to have a working group that will, bring together all of the necessary stakeholders at every level of government, making sure that institution leaders are at the table as well. Um, and looking at, is this something that we can accomplish in this coming legislative session in New York, right? Is this something that we can introduce? Is this something that we can, if we can't get it done this year, we know it takes time, right? Can we lay the groundwork? So that way, maybe this can be something that's implemented next year. But I do want to stress that the longer we wait, the more students get left behind, right? We know that as it stands right now, there's a lot of students who are struggling. As we talked about before, I think the on-time graduation rate for New York was 51%, right? And so we have a lot of students, unfortunately, that do fall into this category of some college, no degree. And while we're continuing to make sure that those students are able to come back to our schools through SUNY and CUNY Reconnect, we want to also ensure that they have all of the needed additional supports to thrive, and that the institutions also, right? Not just the students, but the institutions themselves are really heavily equipped to ensure that they can cater to this population of often part-time college students, parenting students, um, students who are commuting, right? Everything else that we talked about as well. So the form is now in the chat. Y'all can check that out. We're also going to send it out separately with a follow-up email. We'll also have the recording of the webinar at some point within the next week or so we can post that online. Please do share it with folks in your network that would be interested in this as well.
And thank you. Apologies for the little hiccup with that, sharing that in the chat. And something I just really do want to add in terms of just signing on, like we also again understand that this is like um relatively novel for New York State. So I'm sure, if you guys have a lot of questions and everything, even if you don't get to ask them in the webinar itself, we do, ask that you all feel free to reach out to us via email. But yeah, and now we're gonna move on to Q&A. So feel free to share any questions you have in the Q&A portion, or if you want to share in the chat. We'll also turn on the ability for you all to unmute as well if you'd like. So, we do definitely encourage you all to unmute and share any questions you have that way as well.
And also, before we get into Q&A, I just wanted to give a quick thank you and express my heartfelt appreciation to Lo, to Jose, for being here with us today, for sharing your stories, for all of the folks that submitted quotes, for us to be able to publicly include those. Thank you so much for being able to talk about your experience. One of the things that we really cherish here at Young Invincibles is when folks share their lived experience with us, that's not to be taken for granted, right? Oftentimes we're working with students who are really going through heavy things, and it can be really vulnerable to open up around all these economic concerns or other concerns, right? Things that happen in their life that can sometimes be traumatic. So we really appreciate folks using their stories to advocate, right? I think that storytelling is the most powerful weapon that we have in our arsenal. We can share, facts and statistics all day, but it's really people's stories that help change hearts and minds. And so we appreciate everyone, for being part of this process and sharing your stories. Also, to all of y'all who are here, thank you so much for being here and wanting to be a part of this conversation. We invite you now, be part of this conversation. So what are some things that you have seen, or what are some questions you have? What are some recommendations you have about what we shared today? And I think you can also unmute. So if you want to use audio, you can raise your hand or just pop it in the chat, and we should be able to unmute you. If you want to put a question in the Q&A feature, we can also do it that way. But yeah, we would like to have some dialogue if any folks are, moved to chat with us on audio too.
So I'm gonna try to go in order. I know someone dropped this in the Q&A chat. If you guys, or Q&A portion, if you guys can go over there. The question is, where can we find information on the current higher education formula? Great question. So as it stands right now, so there every year after the legislative session, there is a report, a briefing report specifically on higher education that's produced. Typically you can just Google it, but also after the webinar, we'll be sharing some references and links that we used, so we can share it via that. But typically, it's usually on like the legislative websites, or if not, just on the New York State higher education website as well. So thank you for that. And I see that Joshua raised his hand.
Yes, thank you. Just echoing some of the sentiments in the chat. Great work, y'all. Like I always get so excited when I see a Young Invincibles calendar invite or email, because your conversations and the work that you do, I think is so critically important. So thank you all. And I guess my question is just like what does like blue sky success look like? Like a year from now, if we're able to do this work collectively, what would success look like?
So I'll take this first, and then I want to pass it over to the team. But I think in my mind, from a policy perspective, right, 1 year from now, we would love to be in the midst of, having a timeline for launching this. And doesn't mean that we're going to launch it 1 year from now. I think there's a lot of preparation that needs to go into this. One of the ways that, we've talked about and kind of conceptualized that this could work is that it would be a grant-based program that would be managed by the state, by Higher Education Service Corporation, perhaps, or by the CUNY and SUNY schools themselves, right? And that schools would apply for this grant funding based on their qualifications, based on their capacity to actually follow through on implementation, if they were to get the funding, right? So 1 year from now, I think it would be great if we could have, a kind of worked out grant process, worked out idea of, where's the funding going to come from, um, uh, as well as the actual, language itself for the grant. So that way, either the state or the CUNY and SUNY schools, respectively, could start putting pieces into place in order to launch it and to figure out what is their timeline going to be for this pilot. Right, we're proposing 3 to 5 year implementation, so we want to see success after year 3. But if schools are really successful after year 2, right, why continue to wait before scaling this up? Maybe you can have your second phase of schools already starting then. I think the most ideal situation would be to launch it within a year, but all that's from a policy perspective, right? The other thing is like something like this needs uh, it needs some accolades in order to help carry it forward, right? So the more slow and cautious we are, we also risk not having enough attention on something like this being really successful, which would be needed in order to create the political capital, the excitement, right? To further expand it from just, a stage 1 pilot phase to something really big. So I think hopefully 1 year from now, we are, wheels on the ground of having that language and sending the application, sending the grant, language out to schools. But I want to kick things over to Jose or Lo, from your perspective, right? From the student perspective, what do you think this would look like? A successful version of this would look like 1 year out if it were, piloted at your school?
I can go. Honestly, for me, what I had in mind in terms of my blue sky is definitely the community mobilization element of this. So how can we promote the audacity to ask amongst the student population? How can we make the institution more comfortable with students demanding transparency of services or demanding to know where resources for certain, departments or basic needs centers, like, is that an okay conversation to have? As a person who's been working this demonstration project on the ground, I think that we have certainly tried our best to not appear duplicative, but that's a barrier that's come up, in terms of people saying like, well, what is this doing that isn't already being done? And so we hope to expand capacity and be of service overall and show that at the end of the day, it doesn't help necessarily to put things in a hierarchy, but to have a minimum standard at which we should all be meeting, right? We agree that all students should get a certain access to resource or shouldn't be dealing with so many barriers as they try to navigate getting their degree. So for me, it's about continuing to engage the student community about it. Sometimes being involved with policy when it comes to the language and the jargon can be challenging. So for me, my role in this is always to make things obtainable to people and, affirm them as a part of the policy conversation, and continue to qualify students as being a part of policy conversations. That's definitely the center of how we're leading this work. And I know CUNY Cares, we have one more year to continue to kind of prove ourselves. And we really are thankful to Young Invincibles for bringing us into this conversation and continue to, advocate alongside us. And yeah, I'm just excited to see what it looks like going forward. I think that matching this policy with what's happening on the ground is what's needed. It's how we get the institutions to buy in a real way.
Okay, so appreciate that. Thank you so much for that information. So the way it would look for New Paltz would be, it's actually interesting because as you were going on in your explanation, I realized that the majority of the student body at New Paltz is 60% of them are transfer students. So they transfer from community college, just like myself and everything. And of course, there's a lot of bureaucratic jargon and services, and it's hard for students in general to navigate, but even harder for students of color and Black students like myself. So if this pilot program was like launched at SUNY New Paltz, the way that it would be successful is that the students, so a successful pilot at New Paltz would mean Pell and transfer students bring in more resources, advertising and counseling, and the funding is upfront, and outcomes are tracked by race and income on public dashboard. By the next 2 or 3 years, you'd see a higher Black student retention and smaller graduation gaps, because I noticed that as students transferred in, the students in their sophomore and junior years, they wouldn't be at the graduation ceremony. They wouldn't be at the graduation ceremonies because they would transfer out. They would feel like they are not being seen. The resources are unavailable. They're juggling a lot of different things. They're commuters, they're part-time, they're parents, they have rent, and so on and so forth. So the graduation gap would slowly over time like shorten, would get more thin, because there is actually a growing demographic of Black and Hispanic students at SUNY New Paltz. And most importantly, students themselves would shape how the resources are allocated. So supports aren't buried under bureaucracy, but they're visible and accessible. And I think that would start with having that student body that helps maintain those resources, but also in our student government, because the majority of our student governments were ran predominantly by white students because of, it's just the geography and the nature and the history of the school. So that's what it would look like from a SUNY New Paltz point of view.
Thank you, Joe, Slow, and Sean. I just want to again thank you. Like, everything you shared has been so insightful, and to kind of echo a point Joe's kind of just brought up, like especially when it comes to student voice, I think a lot of students tend to self-select into these positions, and that's something we definitely need to be mindful of in the process. Like, why is that happening, and how can we better, do outreach and recruit to students who are being impacted by some of the things that we had shared, to make sure we're really getting a variety of perspectives. And like to kind of just to add a little bit to what Joshua shared, I think like for me especially like a year from now, I want to have at least like myself personally have met with like students and faculty members to convene folks, other community members as well, just because this isn't just like, something that's like contained within the schools, it goes beyond that. So I just might really want to make sure that's also being accounted for as well. And someone had actually asked a question in the Q&A portion, how long was your research for this initiative and how did you gather info? So Sean kind of talked about this, like, this has really been like a year in the making. I can kind of speak from my perspective as, again, a former young advocate. Last fall, a project that we had my group that I was a part of, we actually got to work on higher education, equity and access. And while we didn't, directly kind of address like the funding formula itself, but funding was definitely a big part of it. And we got to do some more research there. We got to, send out a survey even then. And closer to this brief, like this past summer, so the past few months, we did a lot of like landscape research to kind of get a sense of, like, what's currently happening in New York, what's currently happening in other states, like we had mentioned, like Illinois, Tennessee, and California. And we also, again, kind of like, reached out to our network to really kind of get those direct perspectives like we had seen today. Sean, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I would also shout out our director of research, Dr. Linnea Brown, who's formerly came to us from formerly being at CHIO and did a lot of research back in the day on this issue and was able to lend some guidance to us as we launched our research on this topic as someone who's, much more experienced, especially looking into performance funding as one model, right? And how it's gone in different states and in the research space, what the reception has been like looking at that. So that was really key. The other thing is, I think something that we often find in our research here at Young Invincibles is we get testimony, we get really good qualitative analysis of issues that emerge in higher education or healthcare or, workforce access because of our Young Advocates program, because of our really close engagement and work with students in our youth advisory board and all of our other larger events that we do. So we get glimpses of these issues, and then we get to go back and do some of the research to validate it, right? But to Zakira's point, I think we've been seeing different aspects of this through conversations with students, as well as through some of the research that our Young Advocates programs for years have been doing, right? That hint at there's this issue in higher education, there's that one. A lot of them comes back to funding, right, as the basis of how schools are equipped or not equipped to have resources, faculty ratios, staffing ratios, as well as scholarships and other support programs. And so much of it is from that basic angle. So it was great that we were able to dig more into the funding model itself. To one of the most basic things was like, does New York have a higher education funding formula? Right? Is that a thing that exists? Well, kind of, yeah. It's not explicitly stated or talked about that way. But there is a model. There's a method to how higher education institutions in New York get funded, and that method differs, distinctively from some other states. So. Any other questions?
Hey, Sean. Hi, everybody. This is Tom Allison from HCM Strategists, coming to you from Richmond, Virginia. Thank you so much for a great presentation. And once again, you guys are synthesizing the student voice in a way that just no one else is, and no one else really has in a lot of these funding conversations. So, really appreciate your work there. I guess, I can't help myself. I have a little bit of a wonky question about the pilot nature of your recommendation and of your proposal. Just because funding formulas, they often take in data from all the institutions, right? And then you are able to measure how a sector or an individual institution is performing and serving its students, and then maybe how it's improving over time, maybe compared to the sector overall. So I guess I'm just curious if you start with a pilot, handful of institutions. Is it essentially new funds, new money that is on the table that they're going to be competing for? And if that is the case, I could imagine you'd have a lot of institutions that would want to participate, right, to get their their opportunity to access those funds. So I guess, how are you thinking about that, about whether the what would be the downside, right, for an institution joining this pilot? And that's really kind of what I'm getting at, because formulas that force institutions to compete against each other, might change behavior, might serve students better. But a part of that is because they do have skin in the game. They could lose some of their base funding if they're not serving students well. They could, just sort of, and that can be a good thing. That could incentivize a change in behavior, but obviously it's a downside. We don't want to be taking base funds away from an institution. So I guess just if you could just give me a little bit more about how you're thinking about the pilot and just some of those mechanical items that can come in, and again, why wouldn't every institution want to sign up for this pilot?
Yeah, Lo, go ahead.
I just wanted to speak from the pilot perspective in that aspect too, right? I do a lot of outreach that is not at the 3 schools that we've piloted the program at, right? And so far there hasn't necessarily been an institutional response of like, hey, why didn't we get included in this project? And I think why that is particularly at CUNY is that I think the entirety of the institution takes so seriously implementing anything in uniformity in that way, right? Like there is a lot of respect for how the individual institutions show up and how the individual institutions serve each community, right? Like they're completely unique. So I think that, for example, us piloting the Bronx demonstration project, there's an opportunity for 3 institutions to stop kind of operating in that siloed way and maybe explore what that intercollaboration looks like in terms of expanding capacity. So I think that it is important to launch things as a pilot specifically with CUNY. I don't know how that will implicate in terms of uniformity across SUNY, but I think it's always important to move slowly and precautiously with CUNY, because I feel that when you go just very quickly into it and just implement something, it's very easy to kind of continue that trend of student erasure. We weren't a part of this conversation. And I think that people on the ground don't react well to that either. So I think that I do agree with how YI is going about it in terms of seeing how it goes with a few schools and how they respond to the call to action and what it looks like for the policy to be implemented there.
Yeah, so to build off Lo's point, I think CUNY Cares is one great example, right, as a pilot program that's been really successful so far, and is also institution-wide at CUNY in terms of like where they're aiming to grow to and scale to, right? Creating a case for spending all these additional resources. Well, what's the return that students and institutions and the local economy are getting for that investment into a comprehensive access to resources, right, across the Bronx schools. So that's one good model that we're definitely trying to mirror here. I think part of the decision for the pilot is also that we have a point of comparison, right? Of here are all these other schools, right? Like we can point to other MSIs, for example, at CUNY and SUNY respectively, that are not getting these funds, and compare in year 1 and year 2 and year 3. Well, how is our pilot MSI that's getting these additional funds, resources, intentionality, community conversation doing compared to our MSI at the same system that's not getting these resources, right? So we can have that control. Same thing for the high volume transfer school at both systems, SUNY and CUNY. Which can help to really reinforce the case that, having this model, having these additional funds, there's a clear value, there's a clear benefit to it. We also get, a lot of student testimonies, right? As well as broad stakeholder testimonies, if something's really successful this way. The other thing, I think it's important to acknowledge the optics, right, of having that incentive be where we start, right? I think having a carrot and a stick model is a little bit scary to start with, right? I think that could create a lot of concern around institutions losing funding, which is not at all what we want. We know that, there's real enrollment concerns and already, a lot of existing concerns around funding for higher education institutions in New York that the state has been working really aggressively to address, right? As we've had, especially um, during 2020 and after the pandemic, in the preceding years, there's been, a significant enrollment drop, right? And the way in which we fund higher education in New York has grown increasingly based on state support rather than getting, revenues from tuition, which is not what we want, right? We know that recommendation that we had, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, to increase tuition by anywhere from I think it was 5 to 15% at the CUNY schools and 15 to 30% across the SUNY schools. That was outright rejected by the legislature, as well as, by a lot of community organizations and stakeholders and advocates across New York, because there's real concern that students in New York don't have the funds to pay for that, right? If you increase tuition, you're only going to make the enrollment concerns worse. And so I think in the same breath, we know that enrollment is a very real concern, right? And we know that if you're threatening taking funding away from institutions from the get-go for a new formula, right? From institutions that are not doing great in terms of outcomes or equity, that can create a lot of concern about, the other pieces of launching it, right? So we want to be very slow and intentional. And I think, that um, as we gather more success, right, with the model, it's going to create a clearer case for having this new funding and investing it in the places where it really needs to go. But the one of the other things we found is that, we have all of these MSIs, minority serving institutions, right, in New York. CUNY is home to 14 of them. SUNY has two, right? But that term only really refers to the demographics of students that school is hosting. It says nothing about the level of funding support that those schools are getting, right? And so we want to make sure that we're prioritizing those schools that we know have been, historically underinvested in, and in populations that have been historically marginalized to start. And I think, starting there helps to create more of a case for how we can expand as we go. But
And
yeah,
think,
it's definitely tricky to
yeah,
your
I think
point. And also shout out to Tom, sorry for being a YI alum as well. Thank you so much for being here.
yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. Or like, Tom, I think that was a really great question. It's something I'd want to add, in terms of like what you pointed out about the nature of the pilot. All that to say, we don't. Like, the reality is like even if we have a handful of schools that we choose for the pilot, it might impact how the schools that aren't in the pilot might change. Lo can kind of like fact check me on this, but I remember hearing something about CUNY Cares where, even though it's three institutions, um, a lot of other CUNYs kind of recognize the need for more housing and basic needs support and employ staff members to mitigate that, even though they're not part of the pilot. So I think that could definitely be something that happens here as well. Or if there are changes happening on the at the pilots, other CUNYs and CUNYs might follow suit. And I know that Jen raised her hand, but yeah, well, if you want to add anything before I hand it off, yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, sometimes it can influence internal too, because I can affirm that that is true, right? At BCC, for example, they internally responded to that, right? So even though we have a housing specialist on our team, they were like, wait, we've been wanting to do this. This is important. And in fact, the previous interim president even offered wanting to enhance partnership by matching that person with realtors, right, in the community who could help students who are dealing with certain housing issues. So again, it allows the institution to address the community issue from a unique vantage point from their perspective. And that's, in my opinion, more responsive and more incorporate like an element of community justice into it, right? Like we're not just saying we should do this because it's great, but we should do this because it's impacting these students on the ground in our community.
Jen, you have the floor.
Hey, sorry, I couldn't unmute earlier. I was having a Wi-Fi frozen issue, but I really just thank you guys so much for all this work. And I'm so excited about this. And as someone who has long been glad that the AFT has like 20 years of saying that there should be Title I funding for higher ed, inshallah, then someday maybe. And I just wanted to unmute to say, I just want to speak up a little bit for the stick. and say, I'm really excited about what a kind of funding formula signals in terms of like obligations in our work. And I don't want to pretend that I think that there aren't parts of the sector in which I work that aren't exploitive of students, and that we really should in fact have a kind of mission in terms of like college for all who want it and how do we get there, and that in fact people should feel that squeeze against kind of public education, high quality, well-funded public education, to do that. And I think a funding formula that extends the analysis of the great work that we've done here in New York State in the K through 12 area, and maybe even now to, to 2K, thinking about something as 2K to 20 is extremely exciting, and that there could be a funding formula across that. So I just want to say thank you so much, you guys, for all the work you're doing. You guys are really amazing.
I always tell Jen I'm her biggest fan, and you can definitely hear why. So, and thank you again, Jen, for even like sharing your perspective. But that was a really, really special conversation. So thank you.
Absolutely. I would add, Jen, too, to piggyback on your point. I think that one of the most important accountability measures that should be built into something like this, perhaps not from the get-go, but at some point, needs to be included, is workforce placement, right? Because if we truly want to hold schools accountable, we should be taking into account the extent to which not just they're graduating students, but the extent to which they have students that are working ideally in their field, right? Whether that be in the workforce, in academia, whatever it is, within X years of graduation. And so that's another area where it's really important to have data that's public, and that's disaggregated, and that's shared in a intentional conversational dialogue way with the community at large at a regular intervals, to make sure that we're holding institutions accountable, not just for giving degrees, right, but for getting students the jobs that they're going to school for in the first place. And if a student is graduating with a liberal arts degree and they're still taking time to figure out what they want to do, which was the case for me, right? Liberal arts degrees are also very valid. Then that needs to be factored in. Like, that's a very valid consideration. But at the same time, institutions, career service departments, like, it really behooves them to make sure that they're making good on getting students the experience, the connections, not just the degree, right? But getting their foot in the door with employers and forming those relationships or partnerships with employers that match the areas of education that they're focused on, right? This could be things like internships, making sure that students coming in, they're at, the summer between their freshman and sophomore year are already getting some kind of summer internship, workforce internship, some kind of fellowship. These things are really critical in terms of workforce placement. And so, yeah, all of that is to say, we definitely agree. Some stick, some hard accountability measures are also needed to ensure that we're doing right by students.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I'm evidence of workforce development approach. I've been working for CUNY Cares since when I first returned to CUNY, and it's been my best employment, since having a job in social services prior to returning to CUNY. So myself and even our lead advocate, who's also on this call, like, we're evidence of student parents, student moms, non-traditional students who are able to be through this element too. So I did want to emphasize that I hope that that's a part of the conversation going forward, is making sure that there is some peer element in how this is launched, and making sure that students are on the ground being responsive to students. Because if there's anything that I think CUNY Cares has done well, has been able to like continue to uplift that as a positive approach.
Before, I know that we're nearing time, and before we jump off, I did want to give that a little bit of that historical perspective to show and illustrate how did we get here in terms of the CUNY and SUNY system, and how this pilot program has the potential to rectify the history of education in New York. So, and it's funny enough because I learned a good chunk of this at the Young Advocates program last semester, and I did some more research because I was like, this is gold, this is bars. Let's see what else we got going on. So originally, if y'all didn't know, CUNY was a free college system in New York. It started off as the free school, and it was founded in 1847. So there weren't a lot of us in the country at the time, and my ancestors particularly, we were enslaved at the time. And so so in the 1960s, post 1960s, and early 1970s, CUNY introduced an open enrollment policy, right, to all New York City high school graduates, and that increased the enrollment of Black and Puerto Rican students. And funny enough, later on in 1976, that's when they started charging for tuition as well. So CUNY was the free school, and now it's a tuition-based model. Now, the same goes for SUNY. That was founded later in 1948, right? And SUNY was mostly funded by the state. However, the tuition indeed increased over time. So from 1990, so the early 1990s, all the way up to 2009 to 2010, that was when the recession hit, SUNY resident tuition rose 231%. Right. So these problems and all of this data that I'm sharing, it's not accidental. It's designed. Right. This is not, it just happened and it fell out of the sky type thing. That's why this blue sky pilot is gonna hopefully be able to rectify this entire thing slowly over time. So I just wanted to illustrate the historical narrative to show exactly how we got here, to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jose. Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge, like Joe said, CUNY was free for over 100 years, right? And so when we talk about things like allocating all this additional funding to CUNY, right? Or the New Deal for CUNY, free tuition, like these are not radical ideas. This was done before. It's just a question of who was it done for, right? Um, Also, for me personally, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fact that when my father went to a SUNY school back in the day, Cobleskill, the tuition, he always tells me I could work for a summer and have more than enough money to pay for tuition for the year, right? That was back in the 70s. When my grandparents went to Brooklyn College, it was, completely free back in the day. They were immigrants, from Poland, from Ukraine. And if it wasn't for that being, free Brooklyn College tuition at the time, they wouldn't have been able to get their higher education. So these are not radical ideas, right? We're really just pushing for getting back to making sure that we're investing in the community, investing in the workforce, investing in an inclusive economy.
Um,
Anyone else? We have a couple more minutes. Sorry, Zakira, I think I
you're good. I was
interrupted.
gonna ask the same thing, so you're good. Again, everything that has been asked so far has been really, really important, and also definitely things to consider as you kind of move along with this work. So thank you.
If no one else has any other questions, I want to drop the sign-on letter again, um, and then we have our next steps. So first, read our brief. So we're talking about it today. Please take a few minutes to read the whole brief. It is indeed brief. Um,
Yeah.
Shout out to our comms team for really making this beautiful to look at, by the way, especially Stan. Sign on to our letter. So we have the link for our sign on letter. This will also be sent out with the slides for everyone that registered. But please make sure that you sign on and, to the extent that you're able, please, engage with us. We want to have this working group pushing this proposal forward, tinkering with it, as we need, as we continue to get more and more community and stakeholder voices, making sure that we're being responsive to that. And also getting input from legislators, more legislators, higher education leaders, and so forth and support, most importantly, getting support from them as well. Finally, we also have a coalition, the New York Post-Secondary Basic Needs Coalition, which specifically unites people to work on these issues of basic needs for our students and our families. Our next meeting is going to be on Thursday, September 24th, from 4 to 5 p.m. It's normally the last Thursday of the month, from 4 to 5. So if you're interested, please let us know. You can reach out to Zakira or myself. There's also, I think, a box on the sign-on letter where you can indicate it as well. And then finally, we're doing something very cool and new this fall called the Power Shift Retreat. And I'm going to toss things over to Lisa to say more about this.
Real quick, because I also want to be mindful of time, but for folks who are familiar with a Young Advocates program, this is kind of a consolidated version, and it's essentially a weekend retreat, a weekend program, and it will be from Saturday, November 1st to Sunday, November 2nd. And this retreat is really designed to help young adults ages 18 to 34, because that is, who we work with, really build foundational organizing skills and really foster that community piece that a lot of folks have mentioned in this call. And we're really prioritizing folks who have little to no experience in policy and or advocacy, but who are really passionate about creating positive change. And so this year, our theme centers around academic freedom because there have been so many attacks on academic freedom, especially for a lot of our students who have been censored for whatever reason and doxxed. And so even though this is centered on academic freedom, I do want to emphasize that all of these skills are widely transferable to any sort of type of advocacy that any of our students or folks who are part of, the retreat or Young Advocates program can do. Just a quick note, all meals and travel expenses will be covered by YI. So if you know anyone who might be interested, have them sign up and we will be in touch with next steps. And I don't know if I could reveal where it is, but it will be upstate, about 4.5 hours from the city. I'm not going to reveal all the details, but it's a really beautiful place. And so I think we believe that it will be a really amazing experience for folks who participate. And the interest form is also in the chat. So thank you, Zakira.
Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of team building. I know there's I don't know if we're going to be doing this, but I know there is archery, there's hiking, there's kayaking, there's ropes courses. So in between, working on our organizing skills, we're also going to be out having some fun, building some community around some campfires, making s'mores, stuff like that too. Um, cool. Well, I think that's everything. Final thank you for everyone that joined us today and for being, giving us an hour and a half of your time on a Monday right before the semester starts. So we definitely don't take that for granted. But if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, if you want to continue the conversation, please reach out to us. Our emails are here. We'll also, include them in the follow-up email as well for everyone who signed up or is here with us today. And again, special thank you to Lo, to Jose, for joining us. Huge, huge thank you to Zakira for being such a wonderful summer policy fellow and helping to drive so much of this research, so much of this presentation today, coordinating with all sorts of partners and students and everyone. Zakira has been really wonderful to work with this summer. Shout out to our funders, of course, that make all of this possible. It is not easy to keep the nonprofit lights on at this moment when so many nonprofits are being attacked for the work that they do. So thank you to everyone who funds this work. And to Lisa as well. Lisa is actually our longest New York member, starting in 2020, right? Very start of 2020, our first Young Advocates program. So thank you to Lisa. If I'm forgetting anyone, my apologies, but thank you again to everyone who joined us. Really appreciate y'all being part of this conversation, this advocacy with us. And stay in touch. Don't be a stranger.
Thank you, Sean, too. That Sean has been such an incredible leader with driving this work as well. So yeah, thank you guys.
All right. Bye, everyone.